So, welcome to a modern web browser control, the session. My name is Christoph Wollenhaupt. I've been a FoxPro developer for 28 years, and I'm also a .NET developer and a web developer. I'm the co-owner of FoxPad, have been an international speaker for a very long time. I'm a former contributing editor for FoxPro Advisor, doing the monthly Ask Advisor column. And I've published articles on half a dozen FoxPro magazines and have been a Microsoft MVP from 1997 to 2010. What we are talking about today is what is cefsharp. How do you use cefsharp in Visual FoxPro, because that's what you're interested in. And what you can do with cefsharp, new ideas you might not have considered, things you can do using a web browser that are beyond just showing web pages. And then I'm also talking about technical issues that you might not care about. I found them interesting. Usually I put them at the beginning of my session and then get a feedback that I might have lumped to the practical sides or practical parts early on. So I'm doing this time, so you see that your feedback actually counts. So let's start with, what is cefsharp? Cefsharp is based on Chromium, and Chromium is similar to Chrome. It's actually both based on or created from Google. So Google Chrome is a commercial product, still free, but a commercial closed source product that is based on Chromium, but it's not Chromium. Google Chrome has everything that Chromium has, but in addition, it has licensed codecs, so a video and audio that are not open source, that cannot be shipped in an open source environment, that require Google to pay license fees, like AAC or H.264 or MP3. Those are the codecs that, for instance, if you run Netflix is using these codecs on their website. So if you run Netflix site on the Chromium page, or in a Chromium browser, you would not be able to view these videos. Hop-in is also using one of the licensed codecs. So Hop-in doesn't work on Chromium, it does work in Chrome. Other differences between Chrome and Chromium are that Chromium has Adobe Flash integrated. It's not an important feature because Adobe Flash is end of life is December 2020, so in a couple of months. And Chrome is also tightly integrated into the Google infrastructure. It has automatic updates. It has an app store for Chrome extensions. It has error reporting. Error reporting is something you know when the fan in your computer is suddenly spinning up, because the Google error reporting tool is sending everything that's on your computer, basically. It also has input prediction, another thing where data is sent to Google, synchronization of bookmarks, and anti-phishing support that warns you of pages that look suspicious. Chromium, on the other hand, is an open source tool that is used in an amazingly wide range of applications. The most surprising thing for me was that Chromium web browser is used in the Unreal Engine, which is currently in a battle with Apple. It's a gaming engine, and they use Chromium to display HTML content inside the game or in the menus before. Most of the applications that are available as a web application and as a desktop application actually are only web applications. They use either Chromium or they use a platform called Electron, which basically runs a desktop application as a web application as a desktop application. So if you're using Slack or Trello or Skype or Spotify, Amazon Music, Evernote, Signal, Basecamp, even WhatsApp, Microsoft Teams, and Visual Studio Code, actually, all of those are actually web applications. They are not desktop applications, which is one reason why many of these applications are really memory hogs and really big applications. So Chromium is widely used, and it's not only Google that is using Chromium or small companies. The Chromium Embedded Framework is based on Chromium. The maintainer is Spotify, a Swedish company, And it's a project that allows you to embed Chromium in another application. It's written in C, C++, so any C, C++ application can use it natively. But there are various implementations available that allow the Chromium Embedded Framework, CEF, to be used in different applications. So one of those possibilities we have for FoxPro is actually a WebKit ActiveX control. It's a commercial ActiveX control. If you look at the Chromium Embedded Framework wiki page, you see that Visual FoxPro is supported for Chromium Embedded Framework. That's because of the WebKit ActiveX controls. It adds support for a number of languages that do not natively interface with the Chromium Embedded Framework. And what surprised me, they actually have samples for VFP6 and VFP9. I'm not sure they have a lot of customers, because if you look at the image, it says for Pro, because FoxPro is definitely for pros. And it's not a free product too. The royalty-free desktop license is 599 British pounds, which is in US dollars between $700 and $18, depending on the day and depending on politics. And it's only for desktop. If you run the ActiveX control on a terminal server or on an environment that is not a desktop, then you have to pay extra license fees. The website is on, if you're interested, in www.webkitx.com, where you can download the samples and download a trial version. What I'm talking about in this session is cefsharp. cefsharp is stored on GitHub, like a lot of products, and it's open source. It's open source with a BSD license, which means that you can use it in a commercial product that's not open sourced. And one of the things that they ask for, it's obviously free, it's open source, but you can sponsor them if you want. There's one developer that's a maintainer for the cefsharp part, which in turn uses all the Chromium Embedded Framework parts, which use a couple of other things. So if you use it in a commercial application, it might be a good idea to actually sponsor the developer. For the .NET developers, there's a NuGet package available, cefsharp WinForms. There's also some for WPF and other packages that you can directly use in .NET. So, as you can see, they are quite active. It's not like tool that has been updated last for a year or 2 years ago. The latest version came out 2 days ago. Actually, that's 3 days ago when I took the screenshot. And there have been versions every 2 months, every month. So it's quite active. You get a couple of pre-versions, you get a couple of main versions. The version numbers they use are the same ones as Chromium. Initially, they only released the odd numbers, so 79, 81, 83. And then for some reason, they also released the even number 84, which is the one that you find in the session material and which I'm using for the session. There's 85, but I didn't dare to use the latest version so shortly before the conference in case something goes wrong. Any questions so far?
No questions so far.
Okay, cool. So using cefsharp and Visual FoxPro. Now that you know what cefsharp is, why did I pick it? I started looking at cefsharp in 2015, 5 years ago, and then started using it in 2018. At that time, WebKit ActiveX was not available. It started in 2018. Nobody knew the company. Nobody knew the product. So I used cefsharp. But there are other reasons why I picked cefsharp. Over the time, I had troubles using ActiveX controls in my applications. So I kind of want to minimize anything that I have to register, anything that's based on ActiveX controls, and anything that limits my options, because an ActiveX control is something I cannot change. I only can use the interface, but it's often a very simple interface. It does not allows me to customize things, to make things flexible. So cefsharp just offers a lot more versions, a lot more options, a lot more control, over an ActiveX control. So basically what I want to use is, I want to use this like a .NET developer using dub.NET push from Rick Strahl, and not have to worry about the extra layer. So for everyone who needs to, wants to, or needs time, or that doesn't have the time to follow the session, let's start with a quick overview of what you need to do. The executive summary that you often find in reports for the people too busy to actually read everything in the report. So if you want to distribute cefsharp, you will find a cefbin v84 folder in your session material. You need to deploy this folder into your project root, into put the folder into the folder that has your exe. There's also an fp.net folder, the content of which you can put anywhere you want, but you need to register because that is the last ActiveX control I intend to use, at least for most cases. There's also a CLR host DLL, a dub.net push DLL, and a dub.net push PRG. The ones that you find in the session material are modified versions. They are not the one that Rick ships. I made a couple of extensions or changes which I use in my application, so that's the DLL I put in there. It should work with the one that Rick ships, but I haven't tested it. So just to know that this is not the original one, but a modified one. What you need to keep in mind is that my code is bound to a specific version of dub.net push. So if you have an older version, you cannot use the older version. It has to be the same version number. There's also a cefsharp browser PRG file and a couple of header files that you also need to include into your project. You can add them to your project. You don't have to ship any of these files. They're just needed to compile it. They contain the code that we are going to use. Okay, before you can run this on your customer's computer or on your own computer, what you need to do is to register the .NET DLL, fp.net DLL, using the regasm tool from the Microsoft framework, and you need to use the v4 version. v2 doesn't work. In addition, you have to generate a TLB file. It's not there by default. It's generated by regasm using the TLB option. The TLB file is needed for the Visual FoxPro form designer and for the runtime to load the COM server. If you embed a control, you need the TLB. If you don't, if you just create an object and code, you don't have to. You need to execute this as an administrator. So let's quickly do this. Also show you what these files look like. By default, or the way that you have in your session material is there's only 2 DLLs. When you run this line of code, what you get is the TLB file that is generated along the DLL file. After that is done, you can use this control in Visual FoxPro. So let's look at the steps that are involved in making this work in FoxPro. So I'm going to Visual FoxPro. I create a new, form. Make this a little bit bigger. Then we add an OLE control. In the list that appears in a second. you should have an fp.net container. If you don't, then the registration didn't work. Maybe you didn't execute the command as an administrator. Maybe something else happened. Use the fp.net container and add it to a form. I rename it to Oli browser. Next, I'm going to add a new property that I use to store a reference to my object. And I also add some code to the init method. To load the form. The first two lines are here to move the browser, to make it like a full screen browser. This line instantiates the cefsharp browser class that you find in the session material. So a small side note here, I'm using fxp because if I use a PRG, Visual FoxPro is searching for the PRG file even at runtime. Whereas if I use fxp, it's not searching, so this is one network request less. And then I call the bind to host method, which does all the things necessary to get this one. I pass in my browser control, and I pass in the website that I want to show. So let's execute this. And I end up, after a short delay, with the entire website. Basically, this is the browser. I can do anything that I can do in a browser. The delay is only occurs on the first time we load Ceph in a process. It doesn't, it's quicker this other times after the first time. So let's dive into the cefsharp browser PRG. We look at 4 different parts of the program. There's one thing is there's a one-time setup we need to do before we can use the browser at all. Then we configure the browser, then we call the bind to host method, and then we talk about how you can handle callbacks. So let's start with the one-time setup. There's one important piece of cefsharp, which is actually based on the Chromium Embedded Framework. It is a global instance. You can only configure cefsharp once per process. Once you have configured cefsharp, you cannot change the configuration at all. So you cannot turn switches off and turn switches on after you have initialized. This is important for 2 aspects. First of all, what happened to me quite a bit is when I made changes in my code and I tried it and run the code again, it didn't make any change. Nothing happened. That's because you really have to restart VFP when you make changes to the configuration. As soon as you add a switch, you have to restart VFP. Otherwise, you just work with the old configuration. This also means that cefsharp or Ceph are not really suited for creating add-ins or generic classes where you want to configure cefsharp in an application that might use cefsharp in a different way, in a different configuration. So you have to make sure that, well, you have to be aware that cefsharp can only be configured once, and that's the configuration you're using for the rest of the application while the application is running. Okay. There are a couple of configuration options that we can look at. This is in global init. Global init is the method that is called only once. Actually, it's called every time, but the first thing we do is we check if the cefsharp framework is initialized, and if it is, we just return, because if we execute the code twice, we get an exception. Next, we register scheme handlers, and we also set the language. The language is something you can configure up here. It's for this version I used EN/US English. You can specify any language you want, but you have to specify some language which is used by the browser. The browser does not detect the UI language automatically. You have to pick, choose one. After that, there are a couple of options that are hard-coded in here, which you might want to change, but for now they are just in there. There's like enabling Flash, and then there's enabling some things that we look more in detail on, which are disabled by default. Okay. There are also other options, other things you can configure, like where the cache data is. It's not Chrome, it's not using any of the caches that your browsers on your computer are using. You can specify where the data is stored that this browser is caching. You can also control how certificates are handled, whether invalid certificates are accepted or not, unlike when you're actually using a browser where certificates are always have to be valid at all times. You can change how cookies are handled, whether cookies are deleted after the session closes or not. And if you have problems with the GPU, then you can turn off the GPU or change some of the settings. There's also a way to inject JavaScript extension, V8 extensions, which is a means of providing an object in JavaScript that you can create that is always available to code in the JavaScript. So that you can, for instance, have application-specific things in there. There's extensive documentation on the website on GitHub about the settings you have. The settings class, it contains all the properties you can specify that you want, including, for instance, the agent, the user agent that is used for web service. When you look at the documentation, and if you search something on Google, what you usually end up is some older version of cefsharp. Make sure that you pick the correct one. There's a different, there are entirely different sets of documentation for every single version, just like in .NET. If you look, you can browse by version, and the one I'm using is 84.4. The bind to host method then connects all these things. It loads the assemblies that make up cefsharp and the one that I wrote in addition. It initializes the objects. Then it creates an instance of the WinForm's Chromium web browser and adds to the host control that we added to the form. And finally, after the browser is initialized, it gets the object, the browser object, to register the scheme handler and then to load the address that is specified. This loop here is the reason for the initial delay when we loaded the website for the first time, because it needs to load all 150 megabyte of all kind of data that is in the cefsharp folder. So are there any questions so far?
No question, just one comment. If you can increase the size of your font in the VFP windows, probably just a point or two would be fine, I think.
Okay. Probably doesn't work because I've set it per PLG. Is it? Yeah, probably doesn't work.
Oh, there is another question just came in.
Okay.
Can the address be a file like xxx.pdf? If PDF, will it be shown in the browser or external?
It can be a file. You can use a file URL, and it would show the PDF file, but I'll show you a different way how to do showing a PDF file in the browser later.
Okay, and another question. Do you have to deal with busy or ready state?
No, this waiting is actually waiting until the browser's ready. You only have to deal with that if in JavaScript if you want to do something where you need to for the document to be loaded, but on the browser, this code just waits until it's ready.
One other suggestion, you could turn off your webcam when you're showing code, and that would give a little bit more room for the
I
code.
forgot that. I forgot that.
Okay, that's it for questions.
Okay, thanks. Good point. Okay, so besides showing web pages, what I wanted to do is also to respond to clicks in the code. So the way we did this in the web browser control, in the Internet Explorer-based web browser control, is that I created my own protocol. Instead of HTTP, I would use a app. So app:/next as the URL would trigger the action. And in the event, I would just check is the URL, does it start with app:/next. I implemented this, and it kind of worked until we actually had to deal with a callback. So we integrated a catalog system, and their JavaScript code called a URL that we specified to send us the result, the items that the user selected. So because I was running on the app protocol and the browser was running on the HTTPS protocol, and I was calling NET protocol, this didn't work out. The browser prohibits passing data from one domain to another, from one protocol to the other. So I went into security issues and quickly figured out a different way of doing that. Thing is, with file and HTTP and HTTPS, they all have specific limitations that you can do. If you use file, you can open any file that's on disk. Be because you can open any file, you are limited in what you can send to an HTTP or HTTPS server. If you have an HTTPS site, you might not be able to include HTTP resources. The custom protocols in cefsharp never work like the native one that it implemented, even though there are switches that pretend you can make it work like a native one. So instead of using my own protocol, I switched to HTTPS. What's important here is, even though my code is using HTTPS to call my own handler, this actually does not involve encryption. It's just passing the request to my handler before it's encrypted. So I don't have to deal with certificates or anything for my own responses. So let's look at how you provide content. What you usually do if you show HTML content that is not on a remote server with the web browser controllers, you generate a temporary HTML file and save it to disk, and then you use it, load the file from the temp folder. Or you do something like loading about blank, which is a blank on empty page, and then modify the DOM to add the content that you actually want to show. In both cases, you run into problems when you do features, or when you use features that are only available on HTTPS, because it's not HTTPS, it's not the secure environment. So this cefsharp actually allows us to do a different thing. So what I do in cefsharp is you can specify your own host name. The host name is just like a web server. So it's I make a request to HTTP my app, and it's being intercepted. The host name can only be changed before you call bind to host for the first time. It's part of the configuration, and it can only be configured once for the entire application. So you have to decide what the server name is, the virtual server name is that you want to use. The name of the server must be a valid name it must be a valid name, but it doesn't have to be a registered name. It can be anything that makes up a valid name. You can use an existing domain, or like in my case, I just use my app, or in our actual application, I'm using the name of the application. For each browser window, because you can open multiple browser windows separately or on one form, each browser window has its own configuration object, which contains the code for the callback. So you don't have to decide on what the response handler is for a browser window just once. Just for the name that you're using as a server, that has to be decided once. So let's look at what the config object looks like. The config object can be any object. It can be an object that you created. It can be the form on which you put the browser. It doesn't matter. It's just that this object is used by cefsharp browser PLG to find out what it should do if there's a request coming into the application. So let's look at properties. What I'm doing here is I'm creating an empty object, then I'm adding an index_HTML property and put some HTML into this. When I run this, then the URL that I'm passing is https myapp index.html, and I pass the config option. Show HTML is a small form that just has a web browser and contains the code that I just showed you in the Ceph sample. So if I execute this, what you get is hello world. There's no need to create a temporary file on disk or do some hacking on the DOM level. You just put your HTML file into a property that is named like the file. The only difference is that the period, because that's not a valid name in FoxPro, the period has to be replaced by an underscore. The cefsharp browser PLG uses the file extension to automatically map the extension to the MIME type. So HTML is sent back as text HTML. PDF would be sent back as application PDF. If you need more dynamic content that does not need to respond to whatever parameters you passed in, then you can use an access method with this approach. Important is that you need to deal with encoding. Right now, cefsharp browser expects the string to be ANSI. So whatever the code page of your system is, 1252 for Western European, 1251 for Eastern European systems, and it converts this string to UTF-8. Everything is sent back to UTF-8, but you must send ANSI. You cannot send UTF-8. If you don't send a string, if you have other data, you can use var binary for any other data. The way you change this, for instance, for a PDF file is you read the PDF file into a string in FoxPro and then call the create binary function or cast as var binary and convert it into a binary string. The COM interop layer will automatically send this as a VT array to the C# component, and the C# component then uses this as binary data and not as string data. What if you need to call a method? So let's look at calling a method. If the local path has no extension like HTML or PDF, then cefsharp browser considers to be a method. So if I have https myapp/next as a link anywhere in my code, in my HTML code, this translates to calling the next method on the oConfig object and passing 3 different parameters. Our response is a response object that you can use to fill or return the response. cQuery is anything that follows the question mark in the URL. So anything past the local path. And if there's a post or put request, then cbody will contain any of the post data that your web page or web app sent to the FoxPro application. Let's look at 2 samples for that. Let's first look at a simple form that uses a get method. So instead of creating a config object as empty and adding properties, what I'm doing is I create a class that's my handler. It could be any class. The one thing we need is we still need the index.html. So I define this as a property here, and then fill some HTML in the init. This is a really classic form that has an action, submit, a parameter, and a query string, source from form, 2 input types, and a submit button. Obviously, you would use more modern code in your application, but as a sample, this is easier to read than a full Angular application. The submit method, which is called because the link here is submit. And notice that I don't have to specify HTTPS myapp. I just use, actually that should have submit. I just use submit because the relative path is added. My submit method receives a response object, the query, and the form data, and I output this data. Because this form is not using a post type method here, post, it's sent as a GET request. So when we run this, we have the controls here. We fill in text, some more text, and we submit. And then we get the query string. The query string that we passed in is ignored. It's just the form content, and the form data is empty. And then we send back a request, which is handled in code, response, which is handled in code, by just assigning the string to the response object. So whatever we set the response property to is what's being sent back to the browser and displayed in the browser. If we don't set anything, then this page won't change, and we won't get a response at all. As soon as if we add the method post or do a post request, which most frameworks were doing, so we have the method post here, the data we receive is slightly different. We get this the query string, which contains the source from form, which we used, and we also get the form data in the TC body property parameter. And then again, we can send a response. So these methods let you send any data from JavaScript or from HTML into your application and then send data back. It doesn't have to be a form. Every time a URL is requested, whether that's as part of the action, whether that's part of the source property of an image or the source property for a JavaScript file, or whether it's using the XML HTTP class or Ajax calls, whenever there is a call from inside the browser, from inside the page, that refers to a different, to another URL, and this URL happens to be my app, then your code is being executed. So what you actually can do is you can have services, Java services that request data from your FoxPro application, and then return this data inside, or return this data as JSON to your web page. So you can interact with the web page. Basically, what you're doing is you're creating a virtual server that can handle any request that originates from inside the application. So you are doing the server part without actually having a web server installed and without having to go through the hassle of configuring a web server, configuring certificates, doing all these things that you will need to run your own web server. It's all handled by your application, and it's only available from within your application. If the user takes the URL and copies to a browser or somewhere else, they do not get the same results because only the browser window in your app is actually being able to respond to that page. So let's look at the PowerPoint slide again. So the response property in the response object can be either character or var binary. Character is, again, encoded into UTF-8. Var binary is sent unchanged as binary data. You can also set the status code to any numeric HTML status code, like 200 for OK, or 404 for not found, 500 for server error, whatever you want. And there's a MIME type property that defaults to text HTML, which you can change to any value you want. Keep in mind that the encoding that cefsharp browser PRG applies does depend on the variable type of the response property, whether it's character or var binary, not what you specified in MIME type. So you can specify a text, like text HTML, text MIME type, and still pass back binary data, and it's sent as being transmitted unchanged. This is useful if you do your own encoding for UTF-8 or other encodings and want to send back data encoded. The response object also has some additional data that is kind of request data, isn't really response data. One is the config object, which is the object, usually the object that's being executed. And in addition, you get the cefsharp request object, which contains a lot more data. For instance, post data isn't actually a single value. It's a collection of different values. And cefsharp browser PRG only forwards you one of those because usually you only have one data. But if you have multiple post data, you can use the request object to read all of these. You also get a reference to the resource handler, which is executing these, so you can change more properties for the response than just the MIME type, the response, HTTP error code, and the response. You can do more things with that. And you get the local path, which is the path without the protocol and the query string. So in the sample URL you see below, it's the bolded, highlighted part. That's part of the local path property that you receive. There's another version that I'm working on right now, which you do not have yet in the session material, that's implementing a very simple routing engine. So instead of just having a single method or a single property, you actually can configure multiple paths, multiple routes, and the code will go through the collection and find the longest one that matches. So it checks for the longest one, sees if there's a route in the collection, and once it finds one, it uses the routes collection with the key to figure out the controller object. The controller object is a simple VFP class that has one on-process request method, which receives the same parameters: the config object, the query string, and the post data. There's no support yet for parsing. So in .NET, in ASP.NET Core, for instance, I would just use a route attribute and pass /steps/ and then process ID in curly braces, and it would call my steps or the method that I'm applying this attribute to and pass the process ID as a numeric parameter automatically. In Visual FoxPro right now, it's a little bit more work. You have to take the local path, which would be like something like steps/1, and then you have to get the second word and then turn it into a number. So all of these extra work is still necessary. The code is not yet as far evolved to have sophisticated routing capabilities.
Christoph, we have some questions.
Yes. Okay, sure.
First question, how is the handling of XML or JSON content?
You can pass XML and JSON back, just like you can pass back HTML. You just have to set the MIME type. For XML, it's actually a little bit more complicated because XML has an encoding property in the XML tag. So you need to make sure that this is UTF-8 because what you send back is UTF-8. So there on XML, there could be the risk of having double encoding. For JSON is just text. You just assign the JSON string to the response and then set the MIME type to application JSON. And that's it. And then the JavaScript side can process the JSON string, convert it into object, and then just keep working. Any more questions?
Yes. It sounds like you do not have access to the DOM with cefsharp like you do with IE ActiveX. Is that correct?
You have access, but it's a lot more complicated, and I have not yet tried to do it. I would probably just use a JavaScript script inside my web page and then communicate with my application. But you have access to the JavaScript environment and to the DOM. It's just not as easy. It requires a little bit more work.
Okay. Is cefsharp capable of working with registered protocol handlers like tel:, or mail_?
I have not tried this. I don't know. I didn't have had to yet.
Okay. If your sample code uses 84.4 cefsharp now, what's involved if I want to update to a later version of cefsharp?
You would need to recompile the FP cefsharp class that I'm using to connect to cefsharp because that is bound to the 84.4 version. And you also would need to create a new cef_bin folder that's for the new version, where all the binaries for the new version are in. And then in the cefsharp browser PLG, there's one place. Well, cefsharp browser PLG. I have a list of all versions that are supported. You would need to add another one so that this new version is being found.
That's it for questions.
Okay, great. So there's one thing called Flash, which used to be a big thing on the web. We need to implement or support one catalog that until last year at least used Flash internally. Fortunately, that is almost over. Flash has been announced as an end of life in December 2020. And it's not only not supported, it will actively be removed from browsers and from your computers using the browser updates and Windows Update. Until December 2020, if you still have Flash to support, there's Chromium supports the Pepper plugin API, and Adobe has a Flash player that is compatible with the Pepper plugin API. It's automatically enabled in cefsharp browser, so if it's installed, it gets used. When you go to the Adobe site, you pick the operating system, and then you have to make sure that you pick the 32-bit version for operating Chromium using the PP API, the Pepper plugin API, not the NP API. Printing, if you remember the web browser control based on Internet Explorer, there was an execwb method where you could send all kinds of commands like idm exec print, and it would do show the printer alloc. Chromium works similar. It's just not necessarily much easier to call in from FoxPro. If we go to the if you look at the documentation, what you see is that the print sharp method is actually implemented not in the browser, in the Chromium web browser class, even though it has a Chromium web browser print method. It's implemented in a web browser extension class, and that's a C# thing or .NET thing. In C#, you could just use your web browser object and call the print method. What the C# compiler does behind the scenes, it calls another class, the web browser extension class, and as the first parameter, it passes in the reference to the browser. So what you need to do from FoxPro is you need to call the web browser extension, pass in the reference to the browser you have, and then any other parameter this method requires. It's just one extra step that you need to take care of. For deployment, cefsharp requires the Microsoft.NET Framework 4.5.2. The FP cefsharp and FP.NET DLLs that I'm using, I've built against .NET 4.7.2, but I don't think I'm using any specific features from 4.7. So you should be able to build them against 4.5.2 if you need to. 4.7 runs on most modern systems, including, I think, Vista, which is not exactly modern. So it's reasonable that people actually have 4.7.2 available on their system. One note about performance. In theory, cefsharp and Chrome should have similar performances because they are based on the same code base. In reality, we found that for some customers, cefsharp is sometimes slower. For other customers, it's working at the same speed. I have not yet figured out why that is. But sometimes it can be slower than Chrome. So one thing you need to be aware of. cefsharp is Chromium, and Chromium really needs a lot of memory. When you run cefsharp, what you execute is not just the DLL. It's also using a cefsharp browser subprocess. This is the one that you see when you use Google Chrome. You see a render process, and you see several Chrome exe processes, and that is just one of them. The rendering actually happens on different exe, and cefsharp uses inter-process communication to send the image to your application. This is done for security reasons, so that different domains use a different browser subprocess exe to isolate the entire web page against each other. You see the size it's 152 megabyte. In memory, this can be a lot more because all of the runtime memory that's needed. Usually, this isn't a problem for a desktop application, but it might be a problem if you have a terminal server and there are many, many customers on this terminal server. Your application will use more memory when you use cefsharp than it did before. Any new questions?
Yes, there's one. .NET 5, is that on the roadmap for cefsharp?
I think they want to be backward compatible, so they keep doing this in the lowest possible version that hosts cefsharp.
Okay. What will be the requirements for use on a terminal server or Citrix?
Well, you would obviously need more memory. Basically, the requirements would be the same as if you run Chrome and apps in Chrome, because Chrome needs the same amount of memory. So if your customers are using Chrome apps or Chrome apps in a Chrome browser or Firefox browser, then your requirements are actually met. Otherwise, if they are just using FoxPro apps and the client is asking the users to use the browser outside the terminal window, then you might have problems. So it's basically the same requirements as FoxPro plus the memory usage from Chrome. Any more questions?
No, that's it.
Okay, so what you can do with cefsharp in a Visual FoxPro application? Well, you can obviously show HTML content and show web applications or navigate to web application, but that's not all you can do. So let's look at some other samples. For instance, WebRTC, real-time communication. WebRTC is a standard in HTML, in the former HTML5 standard, that allows you to use audio and video recording. It requires that any URL that you use is an HTTPS URL. The difference between Chrome and cefsharp in your application is that there's no user interface to prompt for permission. So if your code requests the camera and you have enabled the camera in the settings, which cefsharp browser PRG does, then the camera is automatically used and the microphone is automatically used. So it's your responsibility to make sure that your users are notified and have been prompted in your application, have granted permission to use the camera. The browser does not enforce any permission or any prompt. There's actually a great web page on GitHub that shows all kinds of samples. I use this page as kind of a baseline. I ask you if there's a problem on a user's browser. I ask them to go to something like the basic get user media demo page, open camera, which would prompt the user, and if it's working here, then the problem is probably my application. If it's not working here, then it's something else that needs to be fixed, like a driver for the camera. So let's look at what this looks like. And so I'm calling the same page right now using the cefsharp browser. I have the same button here, and if I click this button, then nothing happens. Let's quickly check whether this. Okay. What should happen is that you could see me. It did work like an hour ago, as usual. But the cool thing is WebRTC has another thing. It cannot only stream media from a video camera, from a webcam. It also can stream media from your screen. So if you ever wondered how screen sharing is working in tools like Slack or Skype, or the way that you're seeing the session right now in Hopin, it's using WebRTC screen sharing, a built-in feature that is built into Chrome, which is the reason why the organizers recommended that you're using Chrome instead of other browsers. Unlike the real browser, what we see here is that we do not get any question about whether we actually want to share the screen or not. It's just shared. So we have this page again. We start, and what you should see is that you see the screen that I'm having, the entire screen being shared. So if I move this around, you can see that it's updating this, and because, well, it's kind of an eternal way showing all the screens. So you can share a screen using a web page, and if you want to, you can actually include this into your application. So you don't necessarily have to use remote tools. It's not as easy, obviously. There are some things you need to take care of. If you want to look at all the things you have to do, let's see here. There's one article that on SitePoint that shows how to use WebRTC to build a video. How to build a simple video chat, which would be the same thing whether you're using a video chat or whether you are creating a screen sharing. The whole system works the same way. So there's all kinds of things you need to do, and then there's remote cameras. So it's not as easy. WebRTC is a complex protocol that uses peer-to-peer connections, so it's not even going through the server. The clients talk directly to each other. But it's a possibility that you can use to maybe provide some in-app support in your application. The difference between cefsharp and Chrome is that in cefsharp, you can only share the entire screen. There's no prompt for a particular window. You probably can change the source code, but I guess it's not easy. By default, it's only sharing the screen. Location services was something I was looking forward to, having a GPS device being used and being accessible in my application. But that feature has been removed from 18, because it might never have worked correctly in the first place. So location services do not work. Viewing PDF files. Viewing PDF files is one of those things in the application that you have to do because most printed documents are actually PDF files these days. But viewing them is often a hassle because different customers have different PDF viewers installed, and the browser behaves differently, the viewer behaves differently. Elevated applications behave different than non-elevated applications. There are ActiveX controls, but they come at extra cost. So showing a PDF file is actually not complicated. So I'm reading a PDF file into memory. Then I'm creating another config object, and I'm creating a report.pdf property, in this case _PDF property. And because a PDF is a binary file, I use create binary to convert this to a binary string. And then I'm showing my app report.pdf passing in the config file. This PDF file does not have to come from disk. It's just, for my sample, it's the easiest way. It could be the result of XFX or any other tools that you use to generate a PDF file. It can be read from a memo file. It does not have to be a PDF file on disk. And then I'm showing the PDF file in the native PDF viewer. It looks similar to what you see in Chrome because it's the same control. You can use the control to jump between pages. You can download the PDF file. You can print it. You can rotate it. And you also have options to zoom in or out a PDF page. What you can't do is you cannot add any other buttons or any other features. You can use what is available, but you cannot control it. You cannot modify it. If that's good enough for you, then this is a great alternative to using whatever the default PDF viewer is. Other ideas that you can use. WebRTC records a constant stream of what the camera is showing. it doesn't take a lot of JavaScript to take a snapshot of that and send it as an image using the onProcess request, some handler in your application. So you can use the website as a camera. In this case, you actually don't have to even show the browser. It can be an invisible control that you use because the camera will work even if you don't show the camera stream, the WebRTC stream in the browser. You can capture it on using an invisible canvas object in JavaScript, and then just capture the canvas and turn it into an image. So it's like a camera object. You don't have to use the browser. It's just the code engine. There's a couple of issues if you use WebRTC that we have run into it. The one thing is it's hard to figure out what the actual resolution of the camera is, because the browser reports different resolutions for different cameras that might not even be the real resolutions for a camera. Because WebRTC is also often used for communication like Zoom, some of the cameras mirror the image or rotate the image. And if you put the image into a FoxPro string, then you obviously have to take care of the 16 megabyte limit of FoxPro. We support a scanner, and scanners return individual images, but our customers want to have PDF files that have all the pages in one document. So what you can do is you can create an HTML document that has multiple images combined using data URLs, and then use the print to PDF method in cefsharp to convert it to a PDF file. So this is one more option you have to generate reports, because sometimes it's easier to generate an HTML document than it is to use the FoxPro report writer, FoxPro report designer to create complex UIs or complex layouts. You could also use a browser for Unicode-enabled text boxes. FoxPro has the font class property, which gives some flexibility. But if you want extensive Unicode support and emojis and all of this, you can use cefsharp, a cefsharp container, as the input area, and then just use JavaScript to send it back to your FoxPro application and request data from FoxPro. Or if you want to customize your application, we often use exec_script or evaluate, but this gives access to everything that's in your application, to all data, to the login, to everything that your application can do, including the source code actually, is available. The other thing is the scripting language. FoxPro scripting language is a great choice for us, but it's not necessarily the best choice for your customer. Customers don't find FoxPro developers, but they have plenty of JavaScript developers available. Also, if you ever plan to migrate away from FoxPro, you need a migration plan. If you have exec_script as your customization technology, then you need to support FoxPro forever. Instead, you could run JavaScript. Just create a JavaScript file, provide some objects that access a REST API in your application, and then let the user use these JavaScript objects to access data in your application, isolated from the FoxPro environment. Rich text editing is another feature that is available in HTML. The rich text control that we have, the ActiveX control, is really outdated. It doesn't have support that we expect, like good spell checking, automatic correction, text completion, or a neat-looking UI. Whereas JavaScript editors really have a lot more features. So Quill.js is the one that is used in Slack. If you type a response in Slack, that's actually Quill. And the editor, you can type any text in here. If I'm taking a screenshot right now, you can paste images right into the HTML. There's no need to upload images or anything. You can just type like you would do in any text editor and embed this in your application. It's also open source, by the way. There are tons of JavaScript components available for dashboards, animated charting controls, calendar controls, image editing. All of these things are available. What's not available is new ActiveX controls. Except for the DVI and a few companies, you don't find new ActiveX controls. And often the ActiveX controls you have, they look quite dated. Your customer is comparing your application with the web applications they're using today, not with some outdated ActiveX control. But there's also more in web-based application. Web-based applications support, for instance, WebGL, which allows you to do, if you are sufficient proficient on 3D animations, but it allows you to do 3D animations, real-time rendering, all kind of animations. And the best of which is that this, if the animation or the WebGL object needs data, it doesn't have, you don't have to have a web server. You don't have to move data to a web server off-premise. It's only running inside your application, and so it's a secure environment. Your customer does not lose control over the data. So let's look at what WebGL actually can do. So this one is showing an aquarium. So you have, this is showing 500 fishes in 3D area. You can, these fishes are animated. You see we have about 60 frames per second. You can reduce the number of fishes. You can increase the number of fishes. You can change the perspective and the view of what's showing. All of this is not a video. All of this is rendered inside the browser based on the definition of these objects and animations that have been defined using WebGL. There's another sample here. It's also playing music that I'm not sure if you can hear that, probably not. And it shows any second. You see, it's an animated scene. By moving the mouse, I can move the perspective of the 3D and using reflection. And again, all of this is rendered inside the browser, and it's available to you if you have the knowledge and if you have the artistic skills to do animation. But it's not a technical issue anymore. You don't need an ActiveX control for that. You can just use the browser control. Now, any questions?
Yes, we have one. Would you suggest cefsharp for a hybrid approach to migrate a VFP app to a web app, e.g. based on Angular or Vue.js or React?
Yes, it is one of the things that cefsharp is great at, because you don't have to migrate your entire application. You can just take one part of form, one feature at a time, and create REST services that the website is using or the web page is using inside your app. And these web services could then be implemented in C# or in FoxPro. And so that you could move slowly from a desktop application to a FoxPro application that has classes or COM objects available that would be hosted by a .NET web service on a server over time, and then maybe move them to .NET. So you don't have to learn everything at once. You can start with a single form and embed things like an editor or calendar control or one of the animations inside your application, get your feet wet, hand wet with JavaScript and CSS and HTML and REST APIs, but implementing the APIs in FoxPro. So you can slowly learn the technology that you need, so you don't have to do everything at once. So I think it's a great migration technology, yes.
What was the GPU on when showing those fishes? Or was GPU on when showing those fishes?
Yes, this is the GPU in my virtual machine in VMware, so I have no idea what it is. It's just my laptop computer in a virtual machine, the Windows machine in a virtual machine, and it's doing whatever VMware is using, so providing. So it's not, it's a MacBook, so it's not the most high-end GPU. you would probably have higher frame rates on a real desktop computer that is optimized for GPU. But it's using the GPU, yes.
Okay, that's it for questions.
Okay. So we have a couple of minutes left, I think, for a few technical issues I ran across. So I go quickly through them because probably most of them are not that interesting for all of you. So why did I pick the WinForm version? cefsharp has an off-screen renderer that renders the web page into an image. But that would mean that I would have to update an image control in FoxPro 30 times a second, in addition to handling keyboard, mouse, and touch input. And I just know from experience that updating images in FoxPro doesn't work well for a long time until memory is completed or exhausted. WinForm does need an OLE container, which an image would not. But, well, it's a very simple container control that I'm using, so this works just fine. I'm using fp.net container, which is a couple of lines. It's registered as an insertable control, and it can actually can host any WinForm control you want. You just have to set control and then use www.net bridge for everything else. App domains. If you want to use www.net bridge for UI elements, you have to be aware that the control that is loaded into the form is actually loading MS-Core DLL, which is creating one app domain, and www.net bridge is creating another app domain. You can in .NET you cannot communicate directly between app domains, so you will see all kinds of error messages. This is the reason why my code is creating a new www.net bridge object inside the form in the app domain that MS-Core DLL created, and tells www.net bridge to use this instance instead of its own instance. So I can actually talk to the control on the form. The only thing you need to do is there's an o.net bridge property in www.net bridge that you need to replace with the one that has been created in the app domain of MS-Core DLL. There's certainly a lot of room for improvement. The code is working, and that's all I cared about at that moment. Skip that. And then there's also .NET versioning. The fp.net fp cefsharp component is bound to a specific version of the cefsharp browser. What you can do in .NET is building against one version and then use an arbitrary number of other versions. What you can always do is you can say when component requests a version between this and that version, then return a specific version. But what you can't do is if a component requests a specific version, return one of those other versions that you have available. So you have to rebuild the fp cefsharp DLL for every version of cefsharp you are using. One of the things that were complicated is assembly load context. There's a lot more in the white paper. Basically, you have to be aware that for .NET, there's a big difference whether the DLL that you load is in the same directory that your exe is or in any other directory. So because I have cefsharp in the subdirectory, it's treated differently from DLLs that are in the application directory. And if I test this from VFP, I also get a different behavior because then the relevant exe is VFP9 exe, and only DLLs that are in the VFP9 directory are loaded into the so-called default context instead of the load from context. The difference is that anything in the default context cannot access a library assembly in the load from context, but anything loaded in the load from context can access assemblies from the load from context and the default context. So if you get strange error messages that an assembly cannot be found, even though it's in the folder, even though you could just load it using www.net bridge, it's because it might be in the load from context and it might be referenced from the default context. So the way I solve this is fp cefsharp DLL is inside the cefsharp folder, and it's only referencing cefsharp, and all my other DLLs are in my project folder, and are therefore loaded in the default context. So let me summarize what we have learned today. So the thing you need to do is get rid of the Microsoft Web Browser control in your application. It's so outdated. It's such a security risk. There are so many better alternatives available. Also, cefsharp is not just about displaying web pages. You can use a lot more features than just web pages. You can even use features that do not require you to display with the web page at all. And cefsharp allows you to tap into modern UI and application design without having to rewrite everything right now. You can do smaller elements, smaller parts of your application, just one page on a page frame, just one control, whatever you want, and try to learn these new technologies and make them accessible to your application. So, having said that, please remember to fill out your evaluation, and please let me know any feedback you have in the notes. So, thank you very much, and have a nice day.